So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining conference today. So my name is Yuki, will be your MC for this event. So today we have a great insightful session from various stakeholders today, and which give us more understanding of hate speech issue in various contexts and how to address the hate speech effectively with collaboration with various stakeholders and the issues. And previous one, we also have the amazing session about LGBTs communities in Indonesia and how to address the problems of hate speech with various from government sectors and civil societies. So, but if anyone missed any sessions, Asia Center will upload the session on Asia Center YouTube channel, so you can go subscribe and watch the session later as well. And before the session start, I would like to give you a brief webinar guideline. So for the Zoom setting, the participant camera is disabled and the audio is set off for the participants. However, if anyone would like to ask the question, you can either directly ask to the panelist by using the raise hand options, or you can send the questions to the Zoom chat box or Q&A option. Then the moderators will ask the panelists directly. For the speaker, would you please open the camera for the whole session and mute when you're not speaking? And please also keep an eye on the chat box. We will have an updates of the events for the future next events. So now I would like to hand over to Professor Ron to introduce the panel members and to start the sessions.
Hello, good afternoon. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Right, good. Okay.
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes.
I'm Zaharom Nain from the Nottingham University Malaysia campus. I'll be moderating this session. The session called Hate Speech in Malaysia. It's a 1.5-hour session. Each speakers will be given a maximum of 20 minutes to speak, after which hopefully I'll be able to summarize the talk. And after that, I'll leave it a little bit open for questions and answers. Those of you who have burning questions to ask during the presentations themselves, please put it down as in chat form and type it out, and I'll try to deliver this to the rest of the participants, to the rest of the panel, the specific panel. Now, in our panel today is a pretty interesting panel, I would think. Three individuals from three different parts of the media spectrum, as it were. I'll start with Wathshlah Naidu, who is the executive director of CIJ, right? So the Center for Independent Journalism, Malaysia. The Center for Independent Journalism is a non-profit media and freedom of expression watchdog that aspires for a Malaysian society that's democratic, just, and free, where all people will enjoy free media and the freedom to express, seek, and import information. It's one of the most active, if not the most active, media watchdogs, independent media watchdogs in Malaysia, and it's done a lot of good work and continues to do a lot of good work as far as an independent media environment is concerned in the context of Malaysia. The second speaker will be Serene Lim, who's from the Knowledge and Rights with Young People Through Safer Spaces, or KRYSS Network. Now, KRYSS continues, I'm reading from their webpage, continues to adopt the vision that it was first founded on in 2002. That is, we are committed to a world where young people, both young women and men, feel safe and empowered to be themselves, to define and express their own hopes, dreams, and realities, and act upon them without fear of discrimination or violence, where diversity, creativity, and personal capacities are celebrated and nurtured, and each person, regardless of gender, is empowered in body, mind, and soul. That's a KRYSS Network where Serene is the director, if I'm not mistaken, yeah? The final speaker will be Zulkarnain Mohd Yasin. I think he's an officer at the Malaysian Communications and Multimedia Commission, the official, what's the word for it? The official administrator, I guess, of the broadcast and so new media portals and so on and so forth in the context of Malaysia, network in Malaysia. The MCMC has been both praised and cursed many times by various individuals, and continues to plod along despite those criticisms. And we continue to criticize it, hoping that it will be more open and more critical of other things as well. Now, I won't spend too much time. Wathshlah, I think, going to give an overview of recent events in the context of Malaysia, especially during this COVID pandemic, and how hate speech has generated against various groups and individuals in Malaysian society during this period of time. She then looks, I think, at how legislation could come about, what can be done to overcome this, and the problems that are faced in trying to overcome this. Yeah. Serene, on the other hand, will look at particular case studies where she and KRYSS have been doing work as regards to migrants in relation to gender, the problems with gender, the problems with the freedom of expression and the blurry lines that are there between, attacks on online and this notion of freedom of speech. And finally, I think Zulkarnain Mohd Yasin, Zulkarnain Mohd Yasin. It's not the other way around. It's not Mohd Yasin, Zulkarnain. Is it? It's Zulkarnain Mohd Yasin. Okay.
That's correct.
Sorry?
That's correct.
That's right. All right. Zulkarnain Mohd Yasin, I guess, will provide a kind of official perspective as regards hate speech in the context of Malaysia, and what I guess the official line is and what can be done as far as the MCMC is concerned. So without further ado, each will be given about a maximum of 20 minutes. I think that's more than sufficient. I think everyone's agreed on that. So I start with Wathshlah, and the floor is yours, Wathshlah. You got to...
Okay,
Hello?
unmuted myself. Yeah, still getting used to the new norm. Yeah. Thank you very much, Professor Zaharom, and good afternoon to everyone. I'm quite happy to be here on the panel with some very esteemed and distinguished speakers. So I'm just going to sort of give us an understanding of what's the current landscape is in terms of hate speech proliferation in Malaysia. And also see or start the discussion going on what we could do as ways forward in trying to deal with this very difficult issue at the moment. Now, a lot of, if we look at the current overview, I don't want to go into the definition and, the scope of what is hate speech within international context at the moment, because I think that would probably come across in all the other panels as well. But the current landscape, if we see what's been happening in terms of the nature and the trends, there's been an increase, I would say, of language or speech, particularly on online and social media spaces, that amounts to hate speech, which constitutes incitement really to discrimination, hostility, and violence. We've seen a number of incidences where reporters, for example, or media personnel have been targeted merely because they come up with news, or they publish news which seem to hold an opinion which perhaps is frowned upon by certain political leaders or by the government, who first speak up against these individual reporters, which then leads to online attacks. Yeah, so there is a pattern of that. If just to name a few, we saw as early as March this year, we saw Gokha Chief from Malaysia Kini who was targeted. We saw certain language which is really targeted in terms of online violence, and somewhat even gender-based and racist, which could, in certain instances, amount to also hate speech targeted at certain media personnel, such as correspondents from Channel News Asia, as well as South China Morning Post. We've also seen very targeted hate speech directed at human rights defenders. Now, if we trace the pattern in the last few months, human rights defenders, particularly those working on issues related to migrants and refugees, have been targeted. Just to give certain examples, there's been particular targets against Haiti Corps, particular targets against Tenko Emma. And when I say these targets, the speech and the attacks, mainly online, of course, is also somewhat gender-based. We've also seen very attacks against certain communities, and again, these are say communities such as the migrant communities, refugees, stateless person. We've also seen attacks against the LGBT communities or sexual minorities or transgenders. I don't need to go into the examples here because I'm sure Serene will be giving you the examples, but I just want to contextualize this, as I said. And if we understand the nature and dynamics, these attacks and hate speech often has a pattern of race and religion in terms of its dynamics, in terms as its contributory factors, in terms of the rhetoric and the narratives which are being used. And in Malaysia, of course, when we say race, it's often even synonymous with religion. So the attacks are somewhat targeted. If we look back to, we can trace this back for years, but even the last couple of years, we've seen instances when the whole issue of ICET ratification came about. There was so much of attack and so much of language and so much of violence, and true hate speech, yeah? And then we've also seen instances, as I said earlier, where there's a trend where it attacks those sexual minority on the basis of their sexual orientation and gender gender identity and sexual orientation. Issues around nationality and national status becomes a trend as well when migrants, refugees, and all are targeted. Now, what's really the contributory factors? We've seen so many changes just in the last 2.5 years. We saw a new government coming in 2018. We saw the government outed in 2020, just before that the pandemic hit Malaysia to its maximum. So with these changes, we are also seeing a lot of instances where there is a social psychological impact. Yeah, where people, there's an increase in terms of social vigilante, for example. There is also a system where there is systemic heteronormativity. So where there's a target or when there's an attack against sexual minority, then there is certain patterns that could already be seen. We're also seeing how some of these are very, very structural forms of discrimination. Yeah, if we look at the pattern, as I said earlier, there is certain pattern that shows concerted effort or propaganda or rhetoric that is really targeting particular community. The number of attacks, not just against human rights defenders, but actual refugees, individuals from the refugee communities, is so virulent. The hate speech. Of course, if we look at the different threshold of hate speech, it need not necessarily meet the highest threshold of genocide, but the language that's being used definitely, requires a lot of attention and response in terms of both prevention as well as mitigation. Now, there is, of course, that whole issue of the digital spaces and digitalization, which is actually also contributing to the increase of it. Now, as we move towards AI technology, use of algorithm, we are also seeing, again, through a concerted pattern or concerted effort, use of AI like bots, which is contributing to the very organized way of hate speech or hate attack online. And these hate effect, in terms of its impact, it's not just basic doxing, it's got so much of emotional, psychological impact. And if it's not curbed and if the pattern grows and gets exacerbated, and uncontrolled, it may amount to actual violence. You know, we want to draw the line before it triggers that level of violence, that level of incitement. Yeah, the language is already very, very disturbing and has got very critical impact. Now, you know, these are just to contextualize it, right? But how do we then look at ways forward? Our current legal system, you know, has to be really balanced, because one hand, you know, we are all propagates of freedom of expression. So there is no compromise when it comes to the principle and adherence to international standards to freedom of expression. So any action that is taken to address, to mitigate hate speech will have to be structured, you know, within the context of freedom of expression and the exemptions allowed under international law. Now, for us in Malaysia, of course, we have, you know, federal constitution, which protects our freedom of expression, but we need to also look at the UDHR International, the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, Article 19. We need to also look at the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Although Malaysia has not ratified the ICCPR, but the standards are extremely important for us, because Article 19 promotes freedom of expression. At the same time, it also gives us very narrow exemption, and within these narrowed exemption measures that would amount to actual threat to national security or public order. So when we look at again the ways to mitigate or address hate speech, these are certain considerations. In Malaysia, over the years, I mean, there has been extensive use of our different legal framework, different laws, and I'm sure AJ Zo will speak more on this. But I also want to say that there's also been a move to pass harmony legislation and to establish the Harmony Commission, which of course, I mean, we need to see to what extent this is actually going to take off now within the current political environment. But what else can we do? And this is where I would like to pull out the Rabat Plan of Action on the prohibition of advocacy of national, racial, or religious hatred that actually constitute incitement to discrimination, hostility, or violence. Now, the Rabat Plan of Action, which actually pulled together recommendations from various sources, various number of expert group meetings, was actually adopted by the Office of the High Commission for Human Rights and adopted at the HRC also in year 2012. And it really clearly sets out certain recommendations. Just to summarize these ways forward, you know, pulling it from the Rabat Plan of Action, I think obviously, you know, the state has a huge role to play. And what I also want to put up front, we need to be very conscious that taking or adopting legal measures are not necessarily the first choice. There has to be many other ways that we could engage, many other discussions that we need to adopt, many other policies that we need to put in place before it becomes necessary for us to adopt a legal framework that would really curb and stop hate speech. So it's important that state makes the very clear distinction between the types of expression. It's of course a huge concern for us coming from civil society when certain laws have very broad definition, especially if we look at Section 233 of the Communications and Multimedia Act. Sometimes, you know, it's so broad that everything constitutes a criminal offense. We need to also understand that there are certain expressions which are not, that, you know, does not need criminal punishment, which are not criminally punishable, but would actually justify certain, say, civil or administrative sanctions. Of course, there are also those that justifies or amounts or constitutes a criminal offense, yeah? But there are also instances where language or speech is coined or amounts to intolerant language, or which is which is really sometimes racist in nature, but does not cross the line or meet the threshold of hate speech. So in taking or adopting any measures, the state must always adopt a three-part test to ensure that they look at the legality, the proportionality, and the necessity for any kind of restrictions on freedom of expression. So they have to adopt these three-part tests. Now, in cases where criminal action or actions taken for criminal offenses, the Rabat Plan of Action also stresses the importance of a six-part threshold. It really proposes that we need to put it into context, looking at the prevalence of it, and if there are direct correlation between the speech and the action. We need to look at who's the speaker. Is it somebody who is in power, a politician? Or look at the intent. Was the intent to create hate, or to incite, or to contribute towards hostility, discrimination, or violence? Yeah, we need to also look at the actual content and the form of it, and of course to see to what extent that there is an action from the speech. Yeah, and finally, part of the six-part threshold is the likelihood of violence, or any kind of hostility or discrimination, including those that is imminent. So once we've adopted these six parts, that's the threshold that you can actually use to determine if it's a criminal offense, without going into the technicalities of the moment. But obviously there is a need for the state to take other or adopt other mitigating policies to really tackle the root causes. We've seen some of the contributory factors, which are really in terms of race, religion, and social dynamics. But there is a need for the state now to really adopt measures that will address these negative stereotypes, address these levels of stigmatization. There is also, I think we need the state to also ensure, and this is a large call out to all the politicians and the religious leaders, to understand that being a political leader and a religious leader, you have a responsibility in terms of what you say, because it carries a lot more weight than a layperson like us, and all the comments that we say may lead or contribute to certain forms of hate speech. Yeah. And I also want to stress that some of the biggest challenge we have is with the internet intermediaries as well, and they play a huge role. The technology platform, including web hosting companies, social media platforms, they are platforms which exacerbates hate speech, obviously, because of the ease and the use of digitalization. But the platforms, through their various community standards guidelines, have a huge, they've already adopted certain rules, but I think what they need to understand is they need to review these community standards. They need to ensure that the redress mechanisms are readily available and accessible and timely in terms of their response. In a number of cases, including as far back as last year, there were attacks against those who were part of the Women's March on 8 March 2019, which led to online gender-based violence amounting to hate speech as well. So, but the response from these social media platforms varied, of course, but some of them were more responsive than the other. Now, these delays contributes to further harm because, the doxing, the trolling is continuing, and it's causing all the extreme repercussions against individuals who are being targeted online. So I think there is a need for these technology platforms or internet intermediary to ensure their redress mechanisms and their remedies are also up to date. I think we need to hold them accountable too. Now, the next thing is we need the media to come in, and take on a huge responsibility here, because a robust media that shares factual and is sensitive to the content, and which also does not allow its platforms or it as a medium to perpetrate hate speech is really critical. So media, should not, allow its own platform to be misused, but media also has a role in creating the awareness to combat stereotypes and to educate and sensitize the readers. Yeah. And of course, then we pull in the different roles of other entities, such as national human rights mechanisms in the context of Malaysia's Suhakam. We also have, the Suhakam, through its mechanism, should also be able to create that environment that would address hate speech. Of course, civil society play a key role as a key stakeholder. And I'm glad as a civil society here to be on the same panel with Zulkarnain Nain, because I think there is a need for us to talk about multi-stakeholder initiatives. So the responsibility of the owners, in as much as it's on the state, I think as different stakeholders in this process have a role, and we can contribute not just through dialogue, but also trying to see how we can support in terms of policy or other interventions. So on that note, I'm leaving this open now for discussion, of course, but also leaving this as a call to the state in ensuring there is possibilities of institutionalizing the collaboration with the different stakeholders who are able to support. We are not just there to attack. I think we are more ready to support and see how we can play or level off the playing field to ensure that all measures are effective and able to address the situation. Thank you.
Thank you, Wathshlah, for a very thorough, broad stroke approach to hate speech in Malaysia in the current context. I think there's a lot there that we can digest, and there are a lot of ideas there, and a lot of different institutions one can look at for possible solutions. Yeah. We will discuss all that after all speakers have spoken, everyone's spoken. The next speaker, Serene Lim from KRYSS. Now, Serene says, I think is going to be looking at specifically at a couple of things, the design of the social media infrastructure and how that actually contributes towards it, and especially it also fuels hate speech. And enables it to spread wider and quicker. Some of this have been discussed before among different panels in the context of Malaysia, I remember, but I think she's got more insights into this. I think one mustn't forget that kind of infrastructure that's there that's quite different from what was there before. And I think she's going to be talking about how KRYSS has been trying to push back against hate speech. So without further ado, Serene, it's your floor.
Hi, thanks, Professor. So in KRYSS Network, we focus on freedom of expression from a gender lens, and one of our core work is to monitor online gender-based violence and hate speech. And during COVID, we have also done some work to monitor the hate and violence against migrants and refugees. I have three broad analyses to share based on the cases that we have observed. So first, like what Wathshlah said, the hate and violence that we observe is definitely not incidental or spontaneous. It's not just, like one-off speech that, for instance, like that we should start a war against LGBT per se, but it's a structural issues, and it's always rooted in racism, misogyny, and xenophobic. What we are seeing is also a sustained mob that cut across all media platforms, Telegram, Facebook, Twitters, WhatsApp groups, family conversations. It almost seemed organic, that it actually makes sense to hate on these people because it's so normal. Everybody is talking about the same things. Everybody is sharing the same rhetoric. And what we recognize is also distinguishing what is hate speech and what is violence is always not straightforward because especially on social medias, every signal boost actually contributes to the harm that is suffered by the communities or the individuals that is being targeted. In the workshops that we have with survivors of online based violence. And these are not just massive scales of mob attacks online. Some were doxed, some were threatened, and so on. So in the workshops with them, they find it really hard to distinguish what is hate and what is violence, because when you're caught in that, everything, it's noise to you. Like every single notifications that you receive on your Twitters or Instagram or your WhatsApp, it's noise to you. Even the media report that is only reporting on your news, and it links to your original tweets, that could also lead to potential hate and physical violence to you. And this is where Wathshlah has also shared that the design and algorithms of social media actually doesn't help. The core of these platforms are built to amplify engagement. You know, the more people interact, the more people like, retweets, reply, the better it is for them. And contents that is hateful, that is violent, are always trending topics. In our research, right, a woman with the disabilities who is using Twitter to promote stories of people with disability, she said that her everyday tweets focusing on her struggle as a woman of disabilities doesn't get much traction. But the moment she talks about something controversial like sexual harassment, she got 1,000 engagement, and it's not positive, it's all hate against her. And we are also seeing, when it comes to mob attacks, we are seeing a wide range of behaviors, and not all of them falls under criminal behavior, despite their aggregated harm together. For instance, right, a person can say we should start a war against Rohingya, but that is always in response to a neutral tweet being shared by political leaders who merely say that, oh, Rohingya is taking away our jobs. So the boundaries is always not that clear, because it could be a political leaders who legitimize the certain treatments towards a particular communities, and then the followers think that it's okay to take it to the extremes, which is, you know, killing all these people. And secondly, hate speech, more than anything, it's always a discourse of power, dominance, and control that produces the effects of misrecognizing a group of people as unworthy of rights and dignities. In some of our monitorings of the kind of narratives that people use during the mobs against refugees and migrant workers, people were saying things like, this foreign incomers, they refuse to follow our rules. That's why government should just kill them all so that we save on our country funds. Some were saying that, oh, we have too much sympathy and kindness about these people. We shouldn't be looking out for them. They should all just die and rot in prison. They are ungrateful people. That's why they shouldn't, they are not deserving of access to healthcare. So this kind of attacks, they legitimize every people to attack and to spread hate against migrant and refugee groups by treating their voices, presence as offensive to the majorities or the mainstream discourse. And what this essentially leads to is a hierarchies of citizenship, of who is better, who is more deserving of certain rights and and who are not deserving of human rights. This scenarios has led to huge challenge for human rights defenders, because whenever we spoke out about rights for migrant workers, many of us are also attacked. Like, for one example that was raised by Wathshlah was also Heidi Kwa. She was investigated, and she was also threatened with death and rape on social media as well. And lastly, hate speech has everything to do with gender. It's often racism and xenophobics that is being done within a very patriarchy framework. One of the narratives during the migrants, workers, and refugees that we observe is that some of the people are saying that, oh, Rohingya is breeding in our country. They are marrying our women. That's why there's need to defend our border, defend our women in this country. It's always about national sovereignty, the sanctity of our religions, and women and girls always bear the burdens of, defending and preserving our morality. And in some cases, women who spoke up actually, compared to men who speak about the same things, they receive more attacks as compared to their male counterpart. For instance, in Malaysia, there is a 20-year-old woman who committed suicide after her TikTok video went viral. In the video, she was seen being friendly with a migrant worker's colleague. And many attack and abuse her verbally, calling her an easy character and saying that she brought shame to her communities because she's being seen with the migrant workers. And as a result of that, she committed suicide. But media reported this incident as a cyberbully. A lot of people fail to look at the layers of violence and hate here. The first layer is xenophobics, right? The aggressions and hate against her is sort of compounded by the ongoing hates against migrant workers and refugees in this country, especially during the pandemic. And second is definitely gender-based as well. The target was, really aiming at her identity as an Indian woman. Therefore, she should be ashamed for being seen with the migrant workers. And I think there's also an element of classes there. She made a police report, tried to have the video removed. She wrote to the social media admin owners, but it was all ignored. So her access to justice in this sense, she has received some barriers when it comes to her access to justice. And I mean, sometimes when it comes to mob attacks and hate speech attacks, the sheer magnitudes of it makes reporting really, really hard. Even reporting to platforms or to Mcmc or to police report, it's almost impossible to screenshot everything and send it to authorities. That's one. And secondly, definitely not an easy task to distinguish what is hate speech and what is not, because everything is noise to these women. But then what do you do about this, right? And I think lastly, I just want to raise that the point of cost, the cost is almost invisible to authorities, to public, to anyone other than the survivors themselves. I mean, most obviously, in most cases, your mental health is being affected. It affects your ability to work or study. But there's also the real fear of going out, because you never know if the man who stayed down the road or your Grab driver is an aggressor. So consistently in all our interviews with survivors, they have experienced fear of going out. A lot of them are afraid to go out and they choose to stay home for 2 weeks. And then we had one survivor who were unable to work for a year because she had received up to thousands and thousands of DM, and she just couldn't tell whether the next person she's going to meet out there, whether the person would be one of the aggressors. So I think I just want to end by flagging that the problem here is not just a legal one. So more than anything, we need to look at it as an issue at structural and cultural level, and to look at how power and discourse unfold and reproduce at every level. So not just in language, in art, in movies, in healthcare, in schools. And most importantly, we need to look at things at using an intersectional lens. So it is not just about ethnicities or religions. It's also gender, class, disabilities, and many different identities that had an impact on our access to human rights. Thank you.
Thank you, Serene, for depressing us further, I guess. We'll discuss this at length, I guess, if we have the time. I think that the things that we need to look at, the origins of the hate speech, because many people think it's a contemporary thing, whereas I've always argued that it's been in our culture at least since the 1980s, if not the 1970s, and there are reasons for all that, and how it's being perpetuated is also linked to official discourses. So, but talking about official discourses, let me nicely introduce Zulkarnain Nain, who's from the MCMC, who probably will have some solutions for us hopefully, if not more problems. Thank you. So without further ado, Zulkarnain, the stage is yours.
Okay, thank you, Prof. And congratulations to Asha Center for organizing this webinar. And I have the opportunity of having two civil rights groups and proponent to be on the same stage. I must say that it is not a rare opportunity, but very engaging. Most of our engagement with civil society group has been very engaging. And whenever we conduct engagement sessions with the like of Lawyer for Liberty, the Bar Council, it always being not to say that not so nice, but it's a very insightful for a regulator. So to be on the same stage online with the civil rights proponent is actually an honor for a regulator. But that being the case, we have to look into the perspective of a regulator. When we just to explain about Mcmc, we have actually two roles in the sphere of communications and multimedia. That one role is, of course, the obvious one is that we are regulators. So we also being subject to hate speech. We are also being subject to hate speech, a victim of hate speech, because we have been said to be internet police. There's a perceptions that every communications that goes into the network, I have an eyes and binoculars that look into those communications and targeting civil groups or a person of interest. But that is not the case. If you look at the 44 million internet, about 40 million internet users in Malaysia, there is no way that the regulators or the authorities have the ability to look into such content. So what out of that around 40 million internet users in Malaysia, now the type of complaints or the complaints that come to us is only 0.04%. So that is the situation. So we have to, in this context, are we getting, are we hyping it up, or is it a reality? So that is another question. And interestingly, Wathshlah talked about the role of the platform providers. Now, we have no visibility. What we have seen is clouds of conversations. So when you are into that clouds talk about hate speech. So all you see, your visual is hate speech. But there are other positive conversations that are ongoing, but there's no traction, or nobody talks about that part of conversations. So in reality, based on our analysis of the complaints that come to us, the incidence of the spike in hate speech occurs when there is an incident. So when there is an incident, there will be a spike. But after 2 or 3 or 4 days, then the issue will die down. Unless somebody pick up that conversations, then there will be another spark. So that is how we look as a regulator across from our analysis. Is always the case. Incident can be one-off incident, but can be also duration. For example, during elections, we will surely see a spike in hate speech complaints that we take on. So then again, if we look into the perspective of hate speech in terms of regulators, when we talk about regulators or law enforcement agencies, we look into threat to national security, threat to individual, and also to group of people. So when we analyze our focus is always being national security. So our focus relates to race, religion, and the royal institutions. That is 3R. So other than that, we are very much being moderate in the sense that even people ask us to take cases that they say it is hate speech, but our analysis is defamation or is a parody. So that is the standards of content between an individual and an institutions or group of people is different. So that is another challenge for a regulator to impose the standards. So when in this respect, if we look at the current available laws that has been imposed, now we have to the extreme, we have the Sedition Act. Next, we have the Penal Code. Next to it is the lesser of the lesser in a sense that it is Communications and Multimedia Act. Now, under the Communications and Multimedia Act, it is a summons case. So we cannot arrest people without warrant. So it's a summon case. So in the context of if you look at the American law, it is a misdemeanor, small offenses under 233. But if it is Penal Code or Sedition Act, it's a felony. So we need to understand. So when we take action, there are measured in terms of the type of law that being used to address this harm. Okay. Now there is also a check and balance in terms of there is the AGC or Attorney General that look into cases that being brought up by the law enforcement agency. So the first level of check and balance is at the regulator itself. So if it does not fulfill Section 233, for example, I just can speak on behalf of the law that I administer. Now, of course, the criticism is that 233 is very wide. So it's open to abuse. But we are very strict in the sense of administering the law. Because there is another, not hurdle, there's another process of check and balance where the AGC will determine whether it fulfills the ingredient of Section 233. So I would certainly, as a investigating officer or law enforcement agency, I don't want to waste my resources to go to the AGC and come back with no further action or no charges being pressed. So the standards, the quality of the investigation in terms of fulfillment of the ingredients of the offense must be controlled or managed at my level or at the regulator or law enforcement agency level. Otherwise, it's a waste of resources for us to pursue if we know it does not pass the standards set by the AG. But then again, we have another level of control or check and balance, that is the court processes. So the court, ultimately the court will decide. So in that respect, so institutional wise, in terms of criminal justice administrations, there are check and balances. Now, then again, we look at the approach. I've mentioned about the very much role of MCMC, the regulators and the developer. Think about the how do we deal with fake news, for example. Now, people want to know, you go and check, you go and check, you go and check, but where is the channel for us to check? The people might ask us. So what we have done is that we develop portal sebenarnya.my, where a repository of fake news, where people can channel and check. So we provide platform for people to engage, to check, and through collaborations with other agencies, we dispel fake news. Right? So then people can check. So what else do we do? Now, we are a very a proponent of advocacy in terms of building people competency in terms of understanding the threat and the risk. Risk in a sense of a risk against breaching law, a risk against become a victim of hate speech, and where they can get help. So we have our signature program, Klik Dengan Bijak, recently has been acknowledged a recipient of award from KRYSS in terms of advocacy. So we just not only talk about enforcement, there are other alternatives, channeling where people can come, where people can get help. So these are areas of development which not many people talk about. Our MCMC, they talk about only when we take enforcement actions, but there are areas in terms of building capacity. The challenge with Malaysian community is that the level of one literacy in terms of helping themselves. Now, if you look at the intermediaries, the like of Facebook, YouTube, and whatnot, they have channel for report abuse, but people are more comforted in coming to regulators to seek assistance, to seek help, or to resolve their problem. Now, we are not saying that we won't help, but there is more mechanism or more effective way, that is self-help. Now, if we look at the perspective of a regulator against the platform provider, whenever we report abuse, it is they or the platform providers may say that the regulators are trying to stifle freedom of expressions. So most the likelihood of a success, because it's coming from the state. But if it is come from an individual or from the civil society or group of concerned citizens, that would give more weight to the report abuse process. So these are the kind of competency, digital literacy that we are developing. So our plan is that not very much on the enforcement side, but the education, the empowerment also is part of our regulatory activities as part of the development. So now education for probably they will say you are preaching to the converted, but now there are what we need to do is when we assess content, what need to be impart with the people is that you have to wear a neutral lens. So anything that content posted, contextually, you have to be very objective. That competency is lacking. We always wear the lens of race, religion. So when you wear those lens, the context is always race and religion a threat to your belief or your faith, or a threat to your community. So that is the other challenges. So we at MCMC, our Klik Dengan Bijak program is always directed, the true north is the national principles or prinsip-prinsip rukun negara. That is the principle in which we operate, enforce, as well as we advocate. So taking that into perspective, now we have to look into, I just mentioned about how regulators respond, but also again about the reality check. Now we have to see or analyze whether is it the hate speech are institutionalized, one. Second, is it persistent? Thirdly, or is it incidental based? Do we have body of knowledge or data to see what are the trends? Then only we can positively say, confirm or make an appropriate intervention in terms of measured action. What type of appropriate action? What type of law that need to be applied for institutionalized, persistent, and against an incidental based incidents. So if we look into that area of classifications, then we would be in a better position to have an intervention program, to have a to make the platform provider more accountable. So for example, what we have done at MCMC is that now the platform providers, the content assessor resides in Ireland or some other parts of the US. They certainly don't understand the local nuances. So local nuances is important contextually. What we have developed is dictionary for the platform provider to make reference. These are languages that relates to hate speech. So sometimes these are, when I mentioned about, for us, we understand what is harassment, insulting, stereotyping, but for the ordinary people, when they want to report abuse, under which category? So if they wouldn't have that body of knowledge to categorize in terms of categorizing the type of hate speech to fit into the community standards of the platform provider. So we continuously engage a platform provider on a win basis to give them the contextual meaning of the local nuances. So the other area in which moving forward, I think there will be more engagement sessions. We will certainly like to engage the civil society, and as well as women group, as well as what we call as a group that we can identify as vulnerable group. So maybe then we will be more targeted in terms of advocacy. Now, if we look at the Australia, UK, or Europe for that matter, how active their civil society now in protecting or in highlighting these issues to platform provider. They provide public pressure on platform providers. So if you look at that, one approach is that it's always the government need to make laws to hook these platform providers. But is that the correct approach? Can the people do something? Can the NGOs organize something to put pressure on these platform providers? Why always the government? Because it is a shared responsibility. If we were to take, that is sometimes very difficult. one side of the spectrum say, you are not doing enough. You must be toughened on the platform provider. The other side, hey, stop it. You know, you are stifling freedom of expressions. But in the middle, there's always the people. There's always a people movement. Why you just pressure the government? Why not the platform providers? Because laws have jurisdictional issue. Law enforcement authorities have jurisdictional issues over the platform providers to enforce those laws. So I think these are the thinking, the movement that we, as I said, I'm very happy to have the civil society proponent here with on my panel, so that this conversation can continue how we can work together. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Zulkarnain. Yeah, we have about half an hour, which is just great. But before I open it to the floor, I was told by some members of the organizers that maybe before this that maybe I should say something as well. And initially I didn't want to say anything, but then having heard the comments of everyone here, I'll be very brief. I'll speak for maybe about 5 minutes with the notes I've got here. The first is contextualizing everything. Hate speech in Malaysia. Is it something new? I would say, and I've said this before, it's been there, done that. It's nothing new at all. I mean, the media might be different, the media might be different, the technology might be different, but unless we understand the initial origins of hate speech in the context, in the cultural context, as Serene was talking about, in the cultural context of Malaysia, we'll not be able to address it in a very real sense. Technology, legislation can only handle so much. Yeah? So initially, I would say that political hate speech was there since, especially during general elections, since at least the 1970s, the late 70s, through to the Mahathir era, phase one, from the 1981 for about 20 plus years, 2 decades. That whole period was a period where, you know, whenever elections came about, you'd see the amount of hate speech that's there in the newspapers, in the government media, and so on and so forth. And these are things that became commonplace and became legitimized in some ways, in many ways. And what was legitimized is particular forms of hate speech, yeah, that essentially was linked to the powers that be, as it were, yeah, the power structures that were there in Malaysia. And this is also related to ethnic hate speech. And this was, I think, further in the 1980s with the influx of working class migrant workers. We talk about migrant workers, the classes of migrant workers here, working class migrant workers from Indonesia, from Bangladesh. And we must, you know, people saying there was a lot of hate at that point in time spewed against these people without an understanding that it's because Malaysia opened its economy up and there was a need for labor to work in the industries, the new industries that were set up there. So I think that kind of history, that kind of understanding needs to be there before we just, you know, we talk about the need to look at hate speech in the thorough sense. Then there's religious hate speech as well. People talk about religious hate speech. I guess it's an oxymoron, right? If you're religious, you're not going to be indulging in hate speech, but then you do have this thing called religious hate speech as well. And again, when you talk about religious hate speech, there are questions of power here. Yeah, I mean, whose religions are being victimized and whose religions are being put forward as the answers to everything. I mean, most recently, for example, we had one politician saying that Christianity, the Bible is a distortion or something like that, right? And nobody in the ruling coalition wanted to penalize him for him or discipline him for that. Yeah, that's hate speech for me. I don't know about you, but you know. It's this kind of thing. So one has to look at that. That's where the notion of structure, that Serene briefly talks about, and I think if she had the time, she'd go further into it. It's important to look at this notion about religious hate speech. And religious hate speech is of many colors, as it were. You have the conservative exclusive Islam now against the so-called other groups, and also against so-called liberal Islam. The whole word liberal now has become a dirty word, yeah, in the context of Malaysia. Then you have the new migrants coming in, yeah, the speech against the new migrants. A couple of years back, the Rohingyas were seen as a wrong group of people, yeah, that politicians were supportive of them. And then, and this was more than a couple of years ago, and then now they're seen as the you know, the worst, the dregs of the earth, so to speak, yeah, and that's been depicted as well. So I think one must, again, understand the links between depiction and social structure, yeah, and I think that's very necessary in that sense. And the role of the official discourse or the official narrative that legitimizes that kind of hate speech that's there. Let's not beat around the bush. Yeah? The hate speech that's here in Malaysia, in many countries, is legitimized, often is legitimized by the powers that be, yeah, by those in power, right? And if not, the legitimacy that's given to them is in many ways. One is like Trump, where he refuses to acknowledge and condemn white supremacy, for example. Yeah, I mean, you can say that about Trump. Look at our leaders. Yeah, the refusal to condemn and first to acknowledge and then to condemn the speeches that are made. Yeah, so and this is even supported, I would say, based on various studies we've done over the years, supported by official media and institutions, yeah? So it's this kind of thing that perpetuates hate speech, especially in the context of Malaysia, but I think in many parts of the world, in Southeast Asia, certainly. As far as solutions are concerned, legislation, people continuously talk about legislation. I'm a bit concerned about that, yeah, because the question is who's doing the legislation, who's doing the legislating, who's the one looking after us? Are they benign people? And more often than not, in my life in Malaysia, most of them have been very malignant sort of leaders. Yeah, so I think it's very dangerous putting that amount of power in the hands of the so-called legislators, where the legal system itself can be terribly rotten. Yeah, I think we have to be very honest about that. I've always thought that education is the most important thing. And when we're talking about education, we're talking about education on a wide scale, at multi-levels here, not just in schools and universities, but in the media systems as well, yeah, in every newsrooms and even publicly, holding workshops and so on and so forth, yeah. So there is a need to look at that, yeah, and provide channels for greater literacy and for empowerment, as Zulkarnain Nain said just now, yeah, there's that need to provide those kind of channels. Who provides them? Again, it must be a combination of numerous institutions in society, yeah. Political will. At the end of the day, it all depends very much on political will. I mean, one can talk till the cows come home, but if my minister there who says, you know, you must have this media council and then doesn't want to meet us, you know, what kind of political will is there? Seriously, yeah. I mean, yeah, and it's very annoying in that sense when people, you know, talk about this notion about we must do it. Of course we must do it. That's kind of liberal exhortation. Anybody can say we must do it. How are you going to do it, and will you do it? That's another thing altogether. So what my own particular experience has been that the state has not been very helpful in this kind of sense, yeah. And often there are not very many people in the state that's willing to provide that kind of help because of self-interest, yeah. So, but the thing is, the question one needs to ask is the government, is the state a monolithic entity? Maybe not. Trying to be hopeful, you know, and giving the flimsiness of state control at the present moment, the flimsiness of this government that might just fall apart any day now, you know. So maybe civil society must use that, expand the parameters, I would say, push and push, yeah, and ask for more. Although I must admit that that's easier said than done, yeah. So I got a few more. Leaders need to act responsibly, it says here. Now, how difficult is this? It's very, very difficult. I think irresponsibility seems to be the psyche of most of our leaders, yeah. So the notion of being self-interested it seems to be to dominate. Yeah. So the idea of multi-stakeholder, that's great. I think that's something that needs to be there. You need to have multi-stakeholder, but it must be genuine multi-stakeholders. Yeah, when you talk about multi, we talk about really multi-stakeholders. Yeah, I mean, don't try to kid civil society, don't try to kid academia by saying, you know, we're going to have multi-stakeholders, and you find that 3/4 of the contingent comes from one political party, yeah, or defenders of that party. We've got this recently, they've designed for the Ministry of Higher Education as well, the group that's going to be there. Anyway, that's another story. So the rhetoric against, Serene's notion of, I think that's related to intersectionality that Serene talks about, that when you get these multi-stakeholders coming in, that's fine. So finally, you know, I don't want to speak too long. Zulkarnain. It's insightful for regulators to be working in civil groups of society and rights groups that say, when you say the MCMC has been a victim of hate speech, I think you insult the real sufferers of hate speech in that sense. Yeah. The degree of hate speech that's against them, an institution, a strong institution like MCMC is never going to be facing that kind of hate. Yeah. You say regulators do not have the ability to look at all contents, but surely it's not a question of quantity, but one of selectivity. You might not be able to look at all the contents, but the contents you seem to be looking at, you seem to be very selective in terms of the contents you look at, and the people you want to go against. Yeah. In this regard, I think when you talk about security, the national security and all that, I thought, and I'll end on that. I thought of the Al Jazeera documentary. Now, what security are we talking about? And the attempts to, the various attempts at punishing the people who came up with that documentary. Remember, I think most of us remember that documentary about foreign workers and the pandemic at that point in time, right? What role did MCMC play there? You talk about the MCMC, that you must trust MCMC. I think one of the main things that are happening now throughout the world with the studies that Reuters Institute, for example, the University of Oxford have been doing, the studies that I'm part of, indicate that there's this big question of trust deficit. Yeah, trust deficit, especially in the mainstream or official medium. I think that needs to be addressed, not so much the trust, but the lack of trust there, and the reasons for that. And I think the reasons for that, to look at the reasons of that, we have to go back into time, into history, and see the emergence of the whole notion of hate speech. Okay, thank you. Okay, now I'll open this to the floor. We have got about 15 minutes or more. Or do you want to criticize each other or support each other? You know, I mean,
okay. No.
I'm all for that.
Has been posted to me. Okay, right. Now, again, as a regulator, now it's a question of perception and reality. That's why I've mentioned about are we looking at institutionalized, persistent, or incident-based? Now, in terms of, I've mentioned about the filtering at the regulator side. Now, what comes to us is that complaints. So we will investigate complaints, but not all complaints that come to us goes to even the DPP. We have filtered it. So in that sense, we, as an independent regulators, I also being the institution also being criticized by the current and the previous government for not taking action. Only about 2 or 3% of cases or reported cases to us goes to prosecution or even to investigations. So they are saying that we are not doing our job. But by filtering, because that is the kind of I wouldn't say threat, but that is the kind of the perceptions from either the current or the previous government. So that is why we are saying that there is, for us, there is no political dividend. There's no political dividend. What we have in principle is that we are administrating the law and we follow the letter of the law. If that does not fit of that content that they complain, it's defamation. I tell straight to the face of the complainant. If if it is somebody, or I cannot take action. This is purely defamation. You go to civil court. Okay, that is the position that as an independent regulators we have been taking. Our compass is true north. Whatever in the provisions of the law, we interpret it or we administer it according to the standards that we set. Trying to stretch out, we will say no. So that is the position that we are taking. And I have mentioned this to the leaders of the previous government and the current government. You say, if you try to stretch the law beyond the limit of the letters of the law, you will suffer, in the sense that there's no political dividend for you if you take that action. So don't go that path. If you want to go to that path, then that will lead to your downfall. You want to listen to my advice or you want to proceed. So that, as an independent regulator, I have that, we have that clarity in terms of security of tenure. But how many, but there are challenges. That's the risk that as an individual, that person that administers the law is facing in terms of security of tenure. So then again, what is, we are trying our very best to be very independent. So as I've mentioned, even if they say we are not doing our job for not taking action, I can defend it because in principle, I follow the law. So that is one. Secondly, as I mentioned, there's always within the administrations of justice, there is a inbuilt check and balance. So as I mentioned earlier, this is what I mentioned. We can, but we can do, or not we can do, we'll try, but I can assure you it does not fulfill the standards. So then, okay, that is one in terms of integrity of law enforcement agencies. Secondly, on the Al Jazeera, there is always, for regulators or police, there must be a police report lodged or complaint lodged to us. So we cannot, we have to investigate every complaint. In the case of Al Jazeera, there was a police report. Our role there, we as technical agencies just provide, we are providing technical assistance to the police. So there must be reasons for, I wouldn't want to comment, but your question is, what is our role there? It's It's a technical agencies. We are technical experts in terms of preservations of evidence and whatnot. We are expert in forensics, digital forensic. One of our core competency is digital forensics. So we provide that technical expertise. But as I say, education is not just the public. I think, Wathshlah, you mentioned about leaders. So that spike of conversations, hate speech, are triggered by leaders. So that is another area in which we need to, not only, the challenge is not only to educate the public, but also our leaders. As I mentioned, politicians is about political dividends. But if you take, for us, we give advice based on the letters of the law and principles. If they don't want to listen, it's their freedom of expression, so-called. But the consequences, they will lose power. So to be very frank about it, we try to be very independent and give the right advice to the government of the day. We don't play politics. We just advise according to what is harm, threat to the people, to the institutions, and to the national security. Your interpretations, their interpretations, my regulators' interpretation, the public interpretations of national security differs. But of course, like for example, the platform providers' terms of service, not okay. Let's say just platform providers. If there is no real harm, they won't take it down. But you and I know, if such provocative content is not being taken down, and you wait for the physical harm to happen, is in Malay is nasi dah jadi bubur, is pointless. So that perspective also need to be understood in terms of how regulators or law enforcement agencies work. So in the pipeline, we are looking into rolling out initiative, preventive measures where we collaborate. This is competency development. Yeah.
Sorry, Zulkarnain. I'd like to let you have more time, but then there are two questions here that have been raised by participants, and I think we need to address them as well. Okay. Okay. So first one is I don't know whether you can see it. Your talks are so insightful. I'm interested what a panelist calls the neutral lens when reading things on social media and the criteria of identifying which expression is a hate speech. I've heard Zulkarnain mention the term like contractual meaning. I might be wrong. Could you please explain a bit more what it's about and how to gain such sort of meaning? Is that what you said, something about contractual meaning? And if so, can you spend 2 minutes at just maximum trying to explain that to this Kanit Sirishan here?
Okay.
Just 2 minutes. Yeah.
I think this is not contractual. Contextual.
Okay.
So that what I say is contextual, meaning that neutral lens. If it is a parody, it's a parody. You have to accept it, but if you wear a religious or racial lens, then you may be offended. But again, parody also have its limit. That is another problem that we need to address. They allow, for example, platform providers can allow parody accounts, but parody accounts also have can be harmful if it is, as I mentioned, is it institutionalized? What is the intention behind it and what is the content? So contextual wise is, but if it is parody, it's parody. If it's defamation, it's defamation. So I think that's the kind of lens neutrality that we have to observe.
Yeah, I think, okay, thank you very much. Before I move on to the next question, a quick response to that. I think the main problem that people raise is who defines, who determines what's parody and what's not. And I think even the law is very unclear about this if you look at 233 and others, yeah. And for example, the stuff done by Bermana, for example, it's seen as parody. Now people are making complaints against that, you know, and who determines what is parody and what's not. Now, you don't have to answer that, but these are questions that, you know, I'd just like to raise, that it's not as simple as it's depicted to be. Yeah, and I think that's one of the main critiques, not only by civil society in Malaysia, but also academics like me, as regards the various ways of applying the stuff, or the way that MCMC applies the stuff as well. Okay, but that's just okay. Thank you very much for your what you call it, explanation, and Kanit Srichan also agrees. Thanks you there. How do you think the media can encounter manufactured hate messages on social media and WhatsApp by paid cyber troopers and those shared on political blog? And the last question is, does MCMC investigate all complaints, or are there thresholds or criteria that need to be met before complaint is investigated? You know, I mean, two questions that can be answered very, very briefly. I think the first one, any of you can take it. How do you think this media can encounter manufactured hate messages on social media and WhatsApp by paid cyber troopers and those shared on political blogs? How would MCMC address that? You know, hate speech, having defined hate speech, which perhaps is acceptable to everyone, how do you then, you know, investigate the blog?
Okay, yeah.
2 minutes again, or 1 minute.
Again, as I've mentioned, we try to be neutral. Check your facts. We have portal sebenarnya.my. So there we have economic, social, governance category there. So this is where people can check. In terms of, as I've mentioned, if it does not fit the threshold of 233, if it is a general comment or a response, we have to treat it as such. Although the stakeholders, we have many stakeholders, people, government, as well as industry. Now, the people perspective, it is a general comment. The government perspective, it is not a general comment. So you are criticizing the government. So we have to take a balanced approach. What is the letter of the law says? Does it, if it breaches if the speed limit is 110, now the problem is, normally the content is 110, but to the government or to the other stakeholder or interested parties, it is already 120 km/h, exceed the speed limit. But for the person who posted that content, I am driving at the speed limit, within the speed limit. So as regulator, if it is within speed limit, that's it. I think that's an example how we manage that.
Yeah. I think one question that quickly can raise is that speed limit legitimate in that sense? Or has it really been thought through? I think this is a question that people ask about 233. You talk about 233 as a law, but it's a problematic law for many of us, and I think there's a need to investigate that as well. It's not God-given, as it were, it's man-made or human-made. Yeah. Anyway, the next question here, does MCMC investigate all complaints, or are there thresholds or criteria? I think that need to be met for, yeah, you answered that question. Okay. Andrew Harding, you gave a statement here, but surely on social media you should have a sense of what is humor, and that people may mistake your humor for a serious threat. And that people may mistake your humor, certainly in the context of Malaysia here. Any of you want to respond to it, or just, I think that was a statement by Andrew Harding. If you want, I don't know whether he wants to respond to me.
Then again, as I mentioned, there is a control in the the control at regulators level, the AGC level, and the court level.
Okay.
So I think even at the investigation level, if it does not fit the threshold, then if we are guided by the content codes, there are certain things. But another area of conversation that civil society and the regulators or the government can come is that look at, analyze the content, and can we have an agreement? This is the speed limit. Okay, if your current criticism is wide enough, so it's my interpretation, your interpretation is I'm just driving 90. This content is 90.
Okay.
But some other interpretation, oh, this too fast already, this 150. So reaching a consensus or dialogue, having a dialogue of such understanding the limit of the law is important.
Yeah, I think that's important. Yeah, we've got to go in a while. Have Wathshlah and Serene got anything to say? I'm so sorry I left you out all this because the questions were all addressed to Zulkarnain Mohd Yasin here, you know.
I think it's, if I might just add, I think Zulkarnain, you've raised a couple of very important points, and I'm looking at this as possible ways of collaboration. Two main areas, I think, in determining the threshold. I mean, if we can see ways of trying to adopt international standards, especially as illustrated within the Rabat Plan of Action, and having a common policy or guidelines that would address the situation in Malaysia, that would be one way forward. Now, the second thing, I think, in some of the points that we have raised again in Zulkarnain on engaging with the platforms, the digital platforms, the internet platforms, and so on. Again, this is where the issues around internet governance is very fundamental, because we need to go beyond legislations. Problem with legislations, I mean, to be perfectly honest and frank, and exactly what Prof said earlier, it's somewhat regressive to a large extent. It's outdated, you know, it's quite draconian. And a lot of it is open to different kinds of interpretation because we don't understand the thresholds, right? So maybe the legal framework needs a complete overhaul. But aside from legal framework, we really need to look at different ways. You brought up certain important points about need for capacity building, but I think this is a really concerted effort. It needs to be really planned out so that, as you again rightly also said, we need to reach different targets. There are different people who are influencing the narratives and creating the propaganda and contributing to the propaganda. So there are different levels that we need to address. And I'm really looking forward to taking this discussion further on how we can address it beyond the legal framework as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Wathshlah. Finally, Serene. Short,
this is Sharon. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
I just want to respond to the comments on neutral lens. There's no such thing as neutral lens because we all come with our own biases. The danger is when you presume something is neutral. This is what we struggle with Facebook because whenever we raise gender-based violence, they always say that, oh, like we are being neutral, we are fair, blah, blah, blah. But the truth is, all women are suffering harms online. So it's very important to acknowledge that. And I also want to raise that when MCMC said the 3R things, race, gender, and religions, gender is always left out. When 50% of the populations are women, and gender affects men as well. So men who are not men enough are often being made fun of and bullied on social media. So I really hope MCMCs would consider incorporating genders into your work. You know, whether it's by working closely with Ministry of Women's or Ministry of Education. Yeah.
Thanks, Serene. Thank you, everyone. I think this is the beginning of a great relationship between civil society and MCMC. At least I hope it is. Maybe you'll invite me as well. Or maybe Nottingham can provide the avenue for you guys to sit down and do some workshops. Thank you very much. I'm sorry we take up so much time to the organizers. Thanks so much. Yeah.
So thank you so much, Professor Rom and LA panelist members for the insightful session, which show how much intensities of the hate speech impact to the Malaysian societies, and at the same time with the new aspects of cultural and social structure context of the hate speech. So by having this session, we see how much we need to be done together, not alone, like with the collaboration with a lot of like key stakeholder. At the same time, what are the major challenges that we need to evaluate in terms of how effective resolution. So before I end the session, like I would like to thank you, Malaysian Reform Initiative or MARIS, for supporting these panels, which allow us to share knowledge and discuss the issues of hate speech. This could not happen without your support, so thank you, MARIS.